Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to our guests joining from the United States and around the world. My name is Haris Samad, and I'm the Assistant Director of the Atlantic Council's South Asia Center. It is an honor to welcome you to today's program on Russian and Iranian perspectives on the Afghan peace process, which comes at a critical time for Afghanistan as the country, as well as South Asia more broadly, faces an uncertain future and a series of tough milestones over the next 6 months. Before we go any further, I want to recognize and thank our co-hosts and partners on this program. First is the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center, which promotes policies that strengthen stability, democratic values, and prosperity in Eurasia, from Eastern Europe and Turkey in the west to the Caucasus, Russia, and Central Asia in the east. And the second is Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, which promotes democratic values and institutions and advances human rights by reporting the news in countries where a free press is banned by the government or not fully established. I also want to take a moment to thank our esteemed panel, who we'll be introducing in just a moment, for joining today to provide their insights and analysis on the situation. And finally, a reminder that the session is, of course, public and thus on the record. With that, Ambassador John Herbst, the director of the Eurasia Center and former US ambassador to Ukraine, is going to open the conversation and introduce our esteemed panelists. So, Ambassador Herbst, I will pass the mic over to you.
Oh, thank you, Harris. This is a wonderful event, and again, I'd like to thank the South Asia Center and Radio for Europe, RFL, to putting this together. And we were added at the last minute, and we're delighted to be part of this wonderful event. The event will be moderated by Kadir Habib, who's the director of the Afghan service of Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty. And our featured speakers are Ms. Fatima Aman, who's a non-resident senior fellow at the Middle East Institute, Ms. Irina Logunina, Special Projects Director of Russia Service of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and Ambassador Omar Samad, non-resident senior fellow of the Atlantic Council South Asia Center. We have great expertise. I'll turn this over to them to our moderator.
Thank you. Welcome all, and it's a great pleasure to be on this panel with you. On May 1st, US troops began leaving Afghanistan to end America's longest war in history by the end of the summer. More than 2,300 US soldiers were killed and more than 20,000 were also injured as Washington spent an estimated $2 trillion on military operation and civilian aid to Afghanistan. As the departure marks the end of an era for America, many Afghans believe it will create a vacuum which will attract Afghanistan's immediate neighbors and regional powers to their country. Some of these regional powers believe that the United States is after a permanent military base in Afghanistan. But now they have to scramble in the aftermath of the US withdrawal. Global power, Russia and Afghanistan's neighbors, Pakistan and Iran, enjoy influence in the country. During the past 2 decades, India has also emerged as a major ally to Kabul, while China, which shares a land border with Afghanistan, has expressed interest in investing in the country. Most recently, representatives of the extended Troika, comprising of the United States, Russia, China, and Pakistan, met in Doha to discuss ways to support intra-Afghan negotiations and help the parties reach a negotiated settlement and a permanent and comprehensive ceasefire. In recent months, we have witnessed a series of Troika meetings that reflects the US strategy for involving regional powers and implementing its peace plan for Afghanistan. However, the absence of Iran and India, 2 other major stakeholders in Afghanistan's peace and war, shows how complicated the planned process is. Today, in this panel, we will be discussing Russian and Iranian perspectives on the Afghan peace process. So it's a great pleasure to have the panelists with me here as introduced earlier. So we will open the discussion, and Russia and Iran have played almost similar roles in post 9/11 Afghanistan, meaning they have supported the US-led NATO operation and the political system that replaced the Taliban regime, but gradually became suspicious of US objectives and viewed the US military presence as a threat. However, the scope of their roles was different, but the two countries are united in their enmity. How should we assess their interests and their role now? Irena, how Russian government perceives the situation in Afghanistan as the foreign troops are leaving the country and no peace is on the horizon? Are they considering it an opportunity or a challenge?
Right now, the general attitudes of Russia, and that reflects not only in official statements of the Russian official representatives, but also in Russian media. The general feeling is that the US actually failed in Afghanistan, and that the US is leaving the country in the chaos. From the point of view of Russia, Russia has several twisted advantages in this situation. First of all, and when I'm saying advantages, I'm talking about the Kremlin perspective of this process. First of all, in the last 21 years, the political system in Russia and the team that is in Kremlin and around Kremlin has never changed. So that gives Russia an advantage of having a very skilled and knowledgeable people who negotiated or participated in negotiations with generations of Afghan politicians, Afghan groups, and international players around Afghanistan. That's the first point. The second point, the Russian perspective in Afghanistan is slightly easier, I would say, than the US, because Russia doesn't care whether there is a democratic state, whether there is a state that would respect female rights, women's rights, human rights in general, whether this is a viable democracy or not, whether the authorities are elected and whether there are fair and transparent elections. No, what Russia wants is a state that would not constitute a threat to Russia itself, a threat to the neighbors of Russia in terms of the terrorist organizations, in terms of drug trafficking. So that's the only purpose that Russia has in Afghanistan. And this is probably why Russia is claiming that actually the Taliban movement is a national movement in Afghanistan. It doesn't call it an extremist organization. It doesn't call it anything else, but it is a national movement. And that's how the presidential representative in Afghanistan, Zamir Kadyrov, is calling Taliban. So being a national movement, Taliban should be included fully in the political process of Afghanistan, and that's what Russia will try to reach and achieve in the recent negotiations. If they take place in full scale, that's the main goal that Russia is claiming right now. Good.
Thank you. Yeah, we will come to the issue of negotiations and peace talks that Russia is trying to play more and more role in that. So let's hear from Fatima about Iran and Iranian government facing many challenges inside the country. Are they concerned about the current situation in Afghanistan?
Sure. Sure, yes, there is a major concern right now from Iranian perspective. First of all, you know, they created vacuum by the US and the foreign forces leaving Afghanistan being filled by neighboring countries is not the worst case scenario to many observers. The worst case scenario would be if this vacuum would be filled by insurgents, you know, other unknown or known insurgent groups, and eventually, God forbid, a civil war in Afghanistan. So Iranians are very involved and very concerned, and I think they feel they need to do even more. Um, um, they also occasionally talk about, you know, the future of Afghanistan, that the Islamic Emirate cannot be brought back to Afghanistan as it was before the fall of the Taliban. But I predict that they would get more engaged with the, you know, with the Taliban, because worse than the Taliban for Iranian as a neighboring country that has heavily invested in Afghanistan is the a group like ISIS like groups, or Al Qaeda, or foreign terrorist groups. That is the worst case scenario. So I assume they would get even more engaged, and they do have a mediation skill. The Iranian, they have also done in some other places. They can be destructive if they want, but they also can use this skill in bringing parties together. I think they would just get more active, you know, now that the withdrawal is imminent.
Thank you. Both Iranian and Russian regimes, they are interested even than before to get involved in what's going on in Afghanistan, and there is some worry and concern among the policymakers in Moscow and Tehran. Uh, Ambassador Samad, how the Afghans in Afghanistan, and generally the policymakers, how they perceive these involvement from the region and wider region when it comes to Russia, beyond the region. Uh, what is the perception inside Afghanistan?
Thank you, and greetings to everyone. My thanks to the organizers and the sponsors. Um, you see, in Afghanistan, unfortunately, we do not have one mindset on regional and international perspectives on the country itself. Within the government, the Kabul government, as we know it, there are differences of opinion, but obviously the most prominent opinion is that of the presidential palace, the president himself and his entourage. For the past 7 years or so that he has been in office, and I'm not going to go into Mr. Karzai's time, but in my opinion, looking at it from a political and diplomatic perspective, has been very inconsistent in his views towards the region, different countries. Now, Russia being one. The relations between Mr. Ghani and the Russians have not been very warm overall for a variety of reasons. But there's been a lot of flip-flopping going on. And that obviously is not good. But within the broader political arena of Afghanistan, again, you have other players. It's a multiplayer society, and the different axes of influence in Afghanistan, political influence and social influence, obviously, each have their viewpoints on how each country, whether it's Russia or Iran or Pakistan or India or Turkey or Saudi or anybody else, is playing or should be playing a role. And there are some political factions in Afghanistan who have historical ties to some of these countries, going back to the Soviet period, the post-Soviet period, the Mujahideen period, the Taliban period. The 43 years of war in Afghanistan obviously has engaged so much not only the region, but beyond the region as well, that there are bonds and ties and relationships that have developed over time. And even today, we can feel at times the weight of those relationships on Afghan politics and on how they interact with each other. So I would say that in Afghanistan, things are not unipolar; they're multipolar, and that makes it a bit more complex as you try to find a solution, a political solution to the problem that exists. And Russia is a re-emerging power in that sense, because, as you know, after the fall of the Soviet Union, after the withdrawal of the Soviet troops from Afghanistan, Russia for a while was not that much involved. But over the last 20 years, it has again regained an interest, and especially the last 10 years or so, Russia wants to play a major role in Afghanistan for some of the reasons that other participants mentioned. There are obviously other issues as well. There's US-Russia relationship, there's Russia-China relationship over Central Asia. There are issues that have to do with terrorism and ISIS, as was mentioned, the issue of drugs and narcotics, which is a threat to Russia, and making sure that the underbelly of the former Soviet Union is safe enough for Russia to be not seen as a threat. There are a lot of balancing acts going on. Russia sees eye to eye on some issues with Iran, does not see eye to eye on some issues with even India, an old friend. And more, Russia sees eye to eye with Pakistan on how the future should look in Afghanistan, which is an interesting development as Russia and Pakistan relations warm up.
Exactly. We have been witnessing the recent visit of Sergei Lavrov, Russian foreign minister, to India and Pakistan, and mostly focused on peace in Afghanistan. You have mentioned the Soviet era. I would like to pause here a little bit. Soviet waged war on Afghanistan. How that, I wanted to know, that resonate among Afghans today, and what's the perception among different demographic groups, probably younger Afghans who are making the majority of the population. They don't remember or heard about it. Is that perception is going to have an impact on Russia's involvement in Afghanistan?
So, as you said, Afghan society and demographics are different today than they were 30, 40 years ago. The majority of Afghans, the young Afghans, do not remember. They're just hearsay and through readings of history. But they can connect the past to the present. I think everybody in Afghanistan realizes that where we are today and where we might be tomorrow is very much connected to where we were yesterday and where we were in the 1970s when the first debacles took place. So they can make that connection. The interesting point is that the political elites of Afghanistan, who are all in their 50s or more, 60s, they all, in one way or another, were part of that period of time. So they have very clear recollection of what happened to Afghanistan, and they have their own perspectives. The same happens in Russia. As was mentioned, there hasn't been much change in the Russian political structure. Even some say that what we have is an inheritance of the Soviet period. So the historical memory that exists in Russia today and within the Russian political structures is very much knowledgeable about Afghanistan and what has happened. Kabulov himself was a young diplomat back in the 1970s in Afghanistan. He has known and dealt with this issue for almost 45 years or so. Mr. Putin himself, obviously, in his entourage. So I think that people have mixed feelings about the Soviet period. The Soviet period was an agonizing period. Almost 1.5 million Afghans perished during that time. People have to put that in perspective. They have to remember that it was it was an aggression that hurt Afghanistan pretty badly. And there are some parallels that we can draw. I don't want to get into the details, but there are parallels that can be drawn between the time that the Soviets decided to leave and the time that the Najib government fell and the time that now the Americans have decided to leave and not knowing what might happen to Afghanistan. But one of the scenarios that may be a probability is what happened between 89 and 92 going forward. The hope is, my hope as a diplomat, is that we can prevent that from happening, and that we do not take that route, and that we can solve the Afghan political issue and make sure that there's a peace settlement.
Thank you. Iran is yet to be involved in the Afghan peace process, but Russia and US are working together to persuade the Afghan government and the Taliban to conclude the peace process in the country, involving Russia in the ongoing peace effort, with the Taliban continues even after Moscow responded angrily after President Joe Biden accused Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin to be a killer. Verena, what is Russia's real motivation in supporting the peace process?
Well, there are some of the motives were already mentioned here. It's a security issue primarily, but it's also geopolitical, because if Russia presents or is successful, better to say, in establishing some sort of peace process in Afghanistan and some sort of stability, or at least end of hostility, then it will ensure, it will show to the neighbors in Central Asia primarily that it can be a guarantor of peace and stability and their own security as well. So this is a very, I would say, important geopolitical purpose that Russia is pursuing right now. The other issue is, of course, bringing real stability to the Central Asian countries and to protect them from the influence of primarily not Taliban, but of course ISIS. And that's, Fadia already mentioned it, but as a concern for Iran, but that's also very much concern for Russia. Russia really depends on working force and labor from Central Asia. I can tell you that none of the roads can be repaired in Moscow without Central Asian workers being there. And right now, during the COVID time, it was really difficult, and like construction work stopped in Moscow because of the lack of the working force from Central Asia. But with this working force comes also the possibility of extremism, and there were several groups that were actually caught in Moscow trying to recruit ISIS fighters for Syria. So that's real. That is something that Russia really considers as a serious threat, potentially coming from Afghanistan. So that's basically the major reasons why Russia now is involved. Plus, I think that, frankly, looking at the Nagorno-Karabakh and Armenia, Azerbaijan, I think that Mr. Putin actually likes a role to be a peacekeeper and the peace bringer in peace deliverer in the area.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the concerns about the fundamentalists and militants to not cross the borders, Central Asia and to Russia, back to Russia. So why is Moscow supporting the fundamentalist Taliban group now?
Well, primarily because, as I said, Russia doesn't. Russia differentiates between Taliban and ISIS, and Taliban is considered to be a fundamental, but not an extremist group. And even Mr. Kabulov himself said several times that Taliban is on the blacklist only because the Security Council resolution, and if Security Council takes another resolution, Russia would gladly support it. So That's on one hand. On the other hand, I think that there is a general understanding in Smolenskaya Square and the foreign ministry that without somehow negotiating with the Taliban, there cannot be peace in Afghanistan. You cannot reach peace in Afghanistan. That's why Russia not only connected to Taliban, but also helped Taliban with arms, for example, with weapons, with medicine. Which is a pretty open information that Russia never tried to hide that it's doing it. So they try to establish those ties for the future.
Do you think that that support was just to hurt US troops on the ground, or it was a strategic support? We heard that the Russia, Iran, all of these countries, they are saying that we don't want the return of Islamic Emirates in Afghanistan. But in the meantime, the support, let's say, that Russia is showing from the Taliban, how much they can trust the Taliban? We remember once when the Taliban controlled 95% of Afghanistan territory, many of those militant groups that are banned in Russia and in Central Asia, like there are different of them, like MIU and Ansarullah, Jundullah, and many others. They were active under the shadow of the Taliban controlled areas. So how can they trust them once again? Let's say if the Taliban could run over the country once again, do you think that the position that Russia has today, it will hold that position, or it will be changed?
I think that there is no choice, frankly, in this situation, and neither for Russia nor for any other state, because Taliban does control large parts of Afghanistan, and you have to deal with this. I think that that was actually a win-win situation from the point of view of Russia. On one hand, yes, the relationship with the U.S. Worsens considerably in the last 10 years, and especially since 2014, after the annexation of Crimea. So hurting the U.S. Would please Russia in any case. On the other hand, establishing contacts with Taliban for the future also doesn't hurt. On the third reason is when you sell arms, you get profit. And historically, from the Soviet times, from the Soviet war in Afghanistan, even Mujahideen preferred Russian Soviet Kalashnikovs to Chinese, because Chinese Kalashnikovs are very quickly become hot in hot weather, and Russians don't. So there is also a historic memory in this case, as ambassadors mentioned. So it's a win-win situation.
Thank you. Fatima, the pullout of US and NATO forces from Afghanistan could give Iran a room for maneuver within its neighboring country. But if Afghanistan descended in chaos, then Iran could face some more problems, like spillover, security spillover that in the past, and also influx of refugees to the country, and probably a hostile government, like in the past was Taliban. So what do you think? What is the stance of Iran, despite building some connection with the Taliban and supporting it? There were reports, of course, you may have heard that Iran also supported the Taliban when it comes to ammunition and other financial supports in the past. So do you think that that support will continue?
Let me briefly go through the, several phases where Iran got in touch with the Taliban. First, as we all remember, after the fall of the Taliban, Iran was helping the United States, also in the informing the government of Afghanistan, reconstruction of Afghanistan, and according to Ambassador James Dobbins, Iran even offered to train Afghan's national army. They offered to train 20,000 personnel, Afghanistan's military personnel, and build barracks and build military bases. A suggestion that the Bush, Donald Rumsfeld, according to him, didn't even bother to respond to. Then there were, we also faced the axis of evil speech of the State of the Union speech by President Bush, where Iran was also branded along with two other countries as axis of evil. That is, I believe, where Iran and Taliban contacts were initiated. Iran was obviously very worried that Afghanistan could be used as a base to attack Iran. And they, even despite the broad investment they had in Afghanistan, they decided to weaken US forces in Afghanistan, to the point that they won't be able to attack Iran, but not at the expense of the Afghan government. So then there was the emergence of ISIS or ISK. That is the point where Iran, Iran's concern became very serious, thinking that that Afghan government won't be able to combat or to fight this source, to these insurgencies that stem from different parts of the Central Asia, from China, from you name it, all different places gathered in Afghanistan. That is where they decided to get in touch with the Taliban, and eventually they are also, Taliban is not a unified group or organization as many people think. There are also factions who tend toward Iran and are backed by Iran. That is where Iran could help in getting in touch with these factions, or influence them, encourage them to just come to a deal with the Afghan government. But I mean, the serious phase of involvement with the Taliban was after 2015, I believe, when they they really felt there is a chance that the US troop or international troop would pull back from Afghanistan, and the government and the army, the military of Afghanistan won't be able to fight these groups. And that is Iran's worst case scenario. It's a nightmare for them, to have a group, Al-Qaeda-like, Salafi groups, and especially ISIS, a group that is not seeking a country, is not seeking the government, is just destructive. That is their nightmare. They had experienced some, incidents, attacks in Iran, and that is where they got actively involved.
Mm-hmm. And we also know about Fatimiyun, the militia group whose members are recruited by Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and mostly comprised of a Shia minority from Afghanistan. And there are some reports that up to 3,500 of those fighters believed to return to Afghanistan. And December, Iranian Foreign Minister Javad Zarif indicated in the shape of Fatimiyun Brigade Tehran has a large number of armed proxies in Afghanistan. What will be the implication of Iran and support for and relationship with such groups?
That was a terrible argument by Jawad Zarif, stating that if ISIS comes, or not ISIS come to power, if the insurgents group gain momentum in Afghanistan, the Fatemiyun and Zainabiyun, not Zainabiyun are Pakistanis, but Fatemiyun could return to Afghanistan and fight those insurgents. That was a big mistake, first of all. I truly believe that, Afghanistan has been through a lot of ups and downs, but not a religious war. And I believe, sending Afghan Shia to Syria and then mentioning that these people could fight Taliban, or not Taliban, but, insurgents in Afghanistan, that is not a service to Afghan people and to Shia Afghans. The majority of Afghan Shia don't seek a religious system like Iran for Afghanistan. And there are also people who just had to do that, enlisted in the group, went to Syria to have more rights in Iran, rights that they deserve after staying so many years in Iran. Not everyone went to Syria based on the religious conviction. And I don't believe that there is such a thing as an army. We should never think of Afghan Shia as Iran's proxies. And that what Jawad Zarif stated on that interview would create a assumption like that, which is really dangerous for Afghanistan.
Mm-hmm. Ambassador Samal, what do you think of Iran and Russia's support of Taliban, and what will be its implications in the future? Please unmute yourself.
That's a good question. I firmly believe that Iran and Russia share some common threat perceptions. We mentioned ISIS or ISIL, whatever you want to, Daesh, as being one. Drugs is another. Refugees, especially to Iran. And instability and chaos in Afghanistan, they may not view it under the same light. But I think that the other factor that comes into play is their relationship with the United States. Now, as far as the Taliban is concerned, I think that what these countries and many other countries are looking at, and countries do look at what is happening on the ground. It's one thing to claim and the rhetoric that is involved, but it's another thing to see that over the last 20 years, the Taliban, who we all thought were defeated, reemerged for a variety of reasons, not all having to do with Pakistan or not all having to do with one factor or another, but a variety of reasons caused the re-emergence and growth of the Taliban and empowerment of the Taliban over the last 15 years or so. And I think that the countries around the world and the countries in the region, and Russia and Iran, no exception, saw how the events inside Afghanistan evolved, how American involvement took on different forms. So some of them saw this as a threat. Some of them looked beyond, they looked at the strategic implications. And others saw how the Afghan government and governance did not gel to the extent that some of us expected, and did not deliver to the extent that some of us expected. A mix of injustice, corruption, violence, people being hurt, the war going on and on and on and on, year after year, and not seeking a political settlement when we could have. We could have sought a political settlement that would have been much better, with much more leverage 10 years ago, 12 years ago, 14 years ago, even 5 years ago. But we didn't. It continued until everybody realized that this war cannot be won, that this problem cannot be resolved through military means. It needs a political solution. So the countries around us were the first ones to feel all of that. And I think they've kept on adjusting their positions vis-a-vis the Taliban. And they see the Taliban as an integral part of Afghan society, whether we like it or not. There are a lot of things we don't like about them. And there are a lot of things we don't like about other groups as well. So what needs to happen at this point, and I want to focus us on what needs to happen, is that we need to take realities into account. We need to then look at the options that are practical and pragmatic, and we need to find the best solutions in a host of, we have very few choices and not the best choices in the best solutions. But instead of going to the worst scenario, we need to probably aim for what is bad, but not worse. And that means pushing everyone in the region, inside the country, at the great power levels. And I'm happy to see that the troika that is shaping up between the US, China, and Russia, and Pakistan is now part of it as a plus one. Maybe Iran at some point may become a part of this as well, or maybe we will see an expanded troika, is realizing that there is no solution through military means. Despite all the efforts that have been made, we need to refocus everyone on finding a political settlement that rebalances everything in Afghanistan, rebalances politics, economic integration, access to rights, and all of that, as well as the regional components. And that, I think, is the only solution left for Afghanistan, short of what is the worst solution, which is chaos and a civil war that will then also become a proxy war. Because as we all saw, history shows that the geography of Afghanistan is such that it will very quickly turn into a proxy war.
Thank you, Ambassador. We have talked about the tensions between Moscow and Washington, which in different areas that had its impact on their relation in Afghanistan as well. Recently, Juliana Porter, Principal Deputy Spokesperson of State Department, in a press briefing answering a question about Moscow summit, said, between quote and quote, when it comes to engaging with Russia, again, we are clear that we will engage with them in ways that always advance American interests. But we are also clear-eyed about the challenges that Russia poses. When there are opportunities for our relationship with Russia to be constructive, and it is in our mutual interest to do work together, we intend to do so. Rena, can Moscow and Washington partner in delivering a lasting peace agreement in Afghanistan? And can United States trust Russia in this regard?
I think that's the process that already started. I think that's the process that's on the way right now, because as Ambassador Samad mentioned, the Troika is working. There is a general understanding of what should be done, how it should be done, how to convince sides to start a new constructive dialogue and negotiations on concrete agenda. And how to set this agenda. So I think that in this particular situation, almost like in strategic nuclear weapons, Russia and the United States have mutual interests and have all the possibilities to be working together.
Thank you. There were a few reports recently about that the U.S. is looking for some bases to counter terrorism in Afghanistan after the complete withdrawal. We have been witnessed the existence of such bases in the past after 9/11. and Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan. Do you think that Russia, with the influence it has on these countries, will allow the creation of such bases once again in the region?
Well, that's a different issue. That's Central Asia. That's something that Russia almost considers as its sphere of influence, and almost like its own, partly its own territory. So that's completely different story. And of course, this is something that Russia would, Kremlin would fight with by all possible means. And it has been the case already in Kyrgyzstan. We saw it with the base there. That's something that Russia will not tolerate, and Kremlin will not tolerate, never. But that's not about Afghanistan.
Mm-hmm. Iran hasn't been part of these ongoing peace talks, and which is happening here and there, sometimes in Doha, and sometimes we have witnessed these talks happen in Moscow. But we are expecting Istanbul conference, which is expected to be happen under UN, and UN will have a leading role in that. And it is expected that UN will take a leading role of the overall peace process in Afghanistan. President Ghani, in one of his interviews, expressed hope that now, as UN is taking the leading role, Iran can play a greater role in the process. How important is that, Fatima? What do you think?
It is obviously very important. Iran is an immediate neighbor of Afghanistan and a remarkable, a major player in the region. So it was not the best policy of the previous administration to exclude Iran. Whenever there was talk of involving Iran's neighbors, they were talked of, getting engaged with China, with Russia, with Pakistan, act more actively with Pakistan, but there was no mention of Iran. Like Iran wasn't even the part of that part of the world, and Iran. You cannot exclude a neighbor as important as Iran to Afghanistan and to Afghan people. And I think that would be the mistake, would be the damage would be repaired in delaying in getting, the neighbors, mobilizing the neighbors to help Afghanistan. A UN initiated, talk would be more effective, I believe, than say something exclusively led by the US or any particular country. I mean, with UN that would be very helpful. Even there is talks of a regional peacekeeping forces in Afghanistan. So regional meaning with China, Russia, Iran, Pakistan, and even the United States, obviously. We will see, but it has always been more effective. They need funding, obviously. They need financial assistance, and any type of help under the United Nations leadership would be more effective and would be more trusted generally among the neighbors and in Afghanistan.
Thank you very much. So to conclude this discussion, Ambassador Samad, I think the most important role that both countries and other regional countries in the region and powers including China, Pakistan, India, and Central Asian countries, they could play in peace process of Afghanistan. That's very vital. And Afghanistan is considered the connecting point of these countries, connecting these Russia, Central Asia to South Asia and to Persian Gulf. So, looking into from that perspective, Irena referred to that at the beginning, connectivity, the term of connectivity, the role that Afghanistan can play. How do you assess the role of all these countries and bringing peace and stability in Afghanistan overall? Please.
Well, you know that is the favorite scenario outcome that we all would like to see happen. We all talk about connectivity. We all talk about the heart of Asia, as some call it. Afghanistan, for the past 4 decades, has been suffering. It's like a sick body in the middle of this connecting regions. But despite the fact that Afghanistan has been hurt and damaged and injured, the world has continued to evolve and develop. And it's Afghanistan that has suffered. And I think that it's time to realize that we need to heal this injured body, and this country that can play a very important pivotal role beyond what others are doing already in economic integration and connectivity, as you said, in infrastructure building, making progress on the human economic scale. So, having said this, I think that the focus in Turkey, if it happens, if and when it happens, there's a lot of work going on right now on trying to move the peace process into an active status. And so I think that the great powers, the Troika and many others, are realizing that this is the moment, the opportunity that needs to be seized. If we fail to seize it, there is a U.S. withdrawal timetable. There's a lot of hedging taking place inside Afghanistan and outside Afghanistan. And the only option is between a peace process through Istanbul, hopefully, either in May or June, if a few of the hurdles can be overcome. One of the hurdles has to do with the delisting of the Taliban from the UN blacklist, and the other one has to do with the release of the remainder of the Taliban prisoners and whoever else the Taliban have to release. But all of that is obviously very much dependent on getting something from the Taliban in terms of a serious reduction in violence and hopefully a ceasefire that could then allow the different parties to sit around the table and agree on a roadmap that would lead to a transition in Afghanistan. We cannot be stuck where we are right now. I think that we need to unstuck the political situation and the military situation in such a way that we see momentum towards dialogue, towards negotiations, towards compromise, and towards a settlement. There is no other way. The other way we all discussed. It's gloom and doom, and it's very bad for Afghanistan. It's a bad scenario, and it's bad for the region as well. So yes, there are spoilers. Let's also mention there are spoilers who benefit from the war in Afghanistan, whether they're in the region or outside the region or inside Afghanistan. And so you have to also watch for those tendencies to prevent Afghanistan from finding a more stable situation, which would help overall everybody else, including the American exit. The American exit obviously does not mean a total disconnect from Afghanistan. It means that the Americans will continue to play a constructive role in Afghanistan, in the region, whether it's on the counterterrorism part or whether it's on development and making sure that some of the core gains of the Afghan people can be protected, as the Afghans themselves, including the Taliban, agree on a new political order as part of a settlement. So I hope that the focus can now shift to that, and Istanbul is going to be an important catalyst for this change that needs to take place.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Omar Samad, non-resident senior fellow, Atlantic Council South Asia Center. Irina Lagunina, Special Project Editor, Russian Service, Ready for Europe, Radio Liberty. Fatima Aman, a non-resident Senior Fellow, Middle East Institute, for your time and answering my question. I hope that our viewers and audience, they will enjoy the discussion. Back to you, Mr. Ambassador Herbst.
Excuse me. Actually, thank you, Habib, for wonderful moderation and all of our speakers for a very enlightening conversation. And we welcome further opportunities to participate in events with the South Asia Center.
And I think now we will go to, for the closing remarks, Andres Elvis, Near East Regional Director, who oversees Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's broadcast to Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan's tribal areas. Andres?
Yes, that was certainly one of the more interesting conversations I've had the luxury, pleasure, and honor to be listening in on in quite some time, because the role of those two particular countries, Russia and Iran, in the past, the present, and the future of Afghanistan can never be underestimated. And this conversation brought together history, it brought together geography, and in essence, it was about connectivity and evolution. Irina talked about the role of Russia and its aspirations to being a guarantor or grantor of peace, and the complicated relationship with Central Asia, the differentiation that Russia makes between Taliban and ISIS, and the fact that it provides arms to the Taliban. She spoke about Russia and the US. The partnership has begun because both countries have mutual interests in the region. Fatima talked about the different phases of the Iranian-Afghan relationship in the past few decades, going from certainly after 9/11, even some offers to train the Afghan National Army, to now concerns about ISIS. Some missteps, for example, viewing the Hazara minority in Afghanistan through a Shia lens, and that Iran hasn't been included in the peace process really, and perhaps a UN-led process would enable their role to be included as well. Ambassador Samad very much talked about how where we are and where we're going to be is very much connected to yesterday. Common threat perceptions of all the different regional parties, and the fact that they are concerned about what's going on next door or almost next door. The fact that a military solution won't work, and that we have to take realities into account and have a rebalancing. That basically geography and history really do dictate what's going on, that because of Afghanistan's location, any conflict can quickly turn into a proxy war because of the different interests involved. Afghanistan lies at the heart of Asia, and it needs some healing. And we need a roadmap leading to a transition, and the whole process needs to become unstuck. And finally, that the American military exit doesn't mean a total disconnect from the future of Afghanistan, and that the core gains will be protected, the gains that have been made over the past 2 decades. Kader talked about the legacy of the USSR's war, the connection of Russia to South Asia and Afghanistan as a path, and very ably moderated this conversation. I want to thank everybody for the opportunity that we've had here. The RFERL people in this conversation have had to work with the Atlantic Council, and then we look forward to future collaboration with the Atlantic Council. We've worked in the past with the South Asia and Eurasia programs of the Atlantic Council, and very much look forward to working together in the future. And finally, just to specifically thank, I'd like to thank Haris Samad, the Assistant Director of the Atlantic Council South Asia Center, thank Ambassadors Herbst and Samad, thank Fatima, and finally my RFERL colleagues, Irina Lagunina and Kader Habib. Thank you all.